All right, which of the college football teams that still have a legitimate chance to make the playoffs have the greatest chance of losing before the end of the regular season? So we've got 2 weeks left of the regular season, this weekend coming up, and then rivalry weekend, Thanksgiving weekend next weekend. And then that's it for the regular season. And I know a lot of these teams, almost all of these teams that we're going to talk about as far as being playoff caliber teams are probably going to be playing in a conference championship game after that. But I just want to focus on the regular season today for this video because the playoff picture looks very muddy and complicated right now, and you got a lot of people, well, if these teams win out, then, what's going to happen to this team? And, they're not going to get in. They can't jump this. It seems like we find ourselves in this position a lot in college football with a few weeks to go where it looks messy, and then it almost always ends up working itself out. If not by the end of the regular season, then obviously by conference championship weekend, the following weekend. But since we don't know all of the conference championship matchups yet, I just want to focus on the regular season here. Now, for the purposes of what I'm looking at here, I'm considering 9 teams to still have a chance to make the playoff. Basically, any undefeated Power 5 team and any one-loss Power 5 team. Now, there may be some 2-loss team out there somewhere that still thinks they have some type of a hope or a prayer of getting in, and they've got a list of 19 things, and if all 19 of those things happen in that order, then they think they can get in. But this is the 10th year of the college football 4-team playoff. We've never seen a 2-loss team get in. Right now, the highest ranked 2-loss team is Missouri at 9. I don't see any way they get in. I just don't. I mean, Georgia and Bama are headed for a collision course in Atlanta, and the winner of that game is going, not Missouri. So I just don't think there's nothing against Missouri. They're just the highest ranked. I don't think any 2-loss team is going. So here's the 9 teams that, to me, still have a legitimate shot to get into the playoffs, and we'll just go. I'll just put the rankings up. So these are the playoff rankings from yesterday, right here. So obviously Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, Florida State, and Washington. Those are your 5 undefeated Power 5 teams. Now, whether you think those teams are going to end up in the playoffs or not is not the point here. These teams still have a shot to make the playoffs. If you don't believe that, I can't help you. But these teams are undefeated. So if any of these teams went out, they're likely getting in, right? And then you look at your 1-loss teams, and I think these teams still have a legitimate shot as well. Oregon at 9-1, Texas at 9-1, Alabama at 9-1, and Louisville at 9-1. Now, Louisville admittedly is on the outside looking in, and they would need probably multiple 2-loss conference champions in order for them to have a shot to get in. But I just don't think it's fair to leave them out. They have 1 loss, so we're going to consider them in this discussion for the purposes of this debate. So what I want to do is I want to look at the 2 remaining games that each of these 9 teams have and figure out who do y'all think is most likely to lose a game during the regular season out of these 9 games. And I'm going to show you each team's remaining schedule. Now, obviously, Ohio State and Michigan play each other, right? So one of them is guaranteed to lose a game in the regular season. Nobody else in the none of the other 9 teams, so the 7 remaining teams of the 9, none of those 7 are going to play each other in the regular season. Now, Washington and Oregon have already played, but they don't play again in the regular season. I think you understand what I'm saying here. So let's start with Ohio State and Michigan, since we know one of them is going to lose for sure. If you look at Ohio State this week coming up, they are at home against Minnesota. I would say there's not much of a chance that Ohio State blows this here. Minnesota's not a great team. And regardless of what you think about Ohio State, at home, they should be able to take care of business against Minnesota. And then they've got the following week, of course, a game on the road at Michigan where they will be an underdog. Ohio State will. Michigan will be favored. Michigan will be favored in that one. So Ohio State's got pretty close to a gimme game there against Minnesota, and then, of course, a really difficult game to end things on the road at Michigan. And if we go to Michigan's schedule, you will see it is a similar story here. If we pull up Michigan, they play on the road at Maryland this coming week. Now, Maryland started out okay. I think Maryland started 5-0 and hasn't won a game since, or might have won one game since, something like that. Hasn't been good for Maryland the last couple of months of the season, but Michigan goes on the road to Maryland. So, I mean, it is back-to-back road games. They're coming off an emotional win on the road at Penn State without Jim Harbaugh. We still don't know yet what's going to happen with that. The court case or whatever it is scheduled for tomorrow, Friday. So, we'll see. But I can't see a way where, defense and running game travel, and Michigan has a pretty good defense and a pretty good running game. I don't see a way where they lose that game. You would have to say the chances of them losing on the road at Maryland are pretty small, right? But then there's the game at Ohio State. And, yeah, it's at home. And, yeah, I think Michigan will be favored. And, yes, I think Michigan has looked like a better team for the majority of this year. But we have to acknowledge that is a game that Michigan could lose, right? I mean, we have to acknowledge that. This is a top 5 matchup between two undefeated teams. So clearly it's a game they could lose. So because Michigan and Ohio State play each other last week of the season, I actually think Michigan and Ohio State, let's go back. I actually think Michigan and Ohio State, of the 9 teams that still have a shot to make the playoff, which is everybody in the top 10 except Missouri, of the 9 teams that have a chance to make the college football playoff, I think Michigan and Ohio State have the highest chance of losing. And the reason is because one of them has a guaranteed loss because they play each other. Doesn't mean I think they're the worst team. That's nothing to do with it. We're just trying to figure out which one of these playoff teams may end up losing and sort of knocking themselves out of playoff contention here at the very end. Because, like I said in the beginning, there's a lot of people that are thinking we're going to coming across some kind of scenario here where you're going to just have a dogfight over who gets the third and fourth spot and stuff like that. And usually this all works itself out. So I would go with Ohio State, Michigan as the 2 teams most likely to get a loss before the end of the regular season, just because they play each other and one of them has a guaranteed loss. Let's look at Georgia. I guess we'll just go in order now. So when we look at Georgia, Georgia's got one of the tougher remaining schedules of the playoff contending teams, in my opinion. For one reason, they're both on the road this week at Tennessee, next week at Georgia Tech. Now, I'm not going to sit here and try to pretend that Georgia Tech is a good team. They're not. They're first-year head coach. They have not been good. Georgia should go into Atlanta and roll there. Georgia hasn't lost a game at Georgia Tech since 1999, and that was in overtime. Georgia hasn't lost a game at Georgia Tech in regulation since 1989. So the odds of Georgia losing that Georgia Tech game at the end of the season are very, very low. This week, though, they play on the road at Tennessee. Now, leading into the season and for some parts of the season, this looked maybe like one of Georgia's toughest games of the season, because Tennessee struggled last week and struggle's an understatement. It got blown out on the road at Missouri. You got a lot of people that are just giving Tennessee no chance in this game, and while Georgia's favored by about 10 or 11 points and, Georgia likely will win the game, I still think this is a difficult spot for Georgia on the road at Tennessee. Tennessee is one of those teams that is much better at home than they are on the road. They haven't lost a home game in several years now. And this is, it's kind of a backs against the wall Super Bowl type situation for Tennessee here. I know we kind of joked earlier in the season that the South Carolina game was going to be Tennessee's Super Bowl, a revenge game from last year. But because Tennessee has now lost that Missouri game and they're sitting at 3 losses, they're not making a New Year's Six game. Last year they made a New Year's Six game. So Tennessee really doesn't have much to play for in terms of a postseason at this point. It's sort of a, can we be the ones that knock off Georgia type of thing. In other words, I expect Tennessee to throw everything they have at this game. Leave nothing on the table, give it all they got, whatever you want to say. I think Tennessee is going to play with their backs against the wall, and I do think this is a dangerous spot for Georgia. So there's at Tennessee, at Georgia Tech, 2 road games. One of the teams is ranked. Tennessee, this is Georgia's 3rd ranked opponent in a row. Missouri, Ole Miss, now Tennessee. I do think Georgia will win, but you'll see when we go through the rest of the team schedules, this is one of the more difficult remaining schedules. Obviously, Michigan and Ohio State have the 2 toughest remaining schedules because they play each other. Outside of that, though, back-to-back road games at 18 Tennessee, and then in-state rivalry game on the road at Georgia Tech. Not the easiest last 2 games here in terms of playoff contending teams. Let's look at Florida State. Florida State this week plays something called North Alabama at home. Next week, they play on the road at Florida. I kind of look at they're going to destroy North Alabama. I think we all understand that. And then they've got the game to wrap things up on the road at Florida. So I kind of look at this Florida State at Florida game in a similar way that I look at Georgia at Georgia Tech. Clearly, Florida State is a much better team than Florida. They have been over the course of the season. But this is kind of a backs against the wall type of game for Florida. Florida plays on the road at Missouri this coming week. They're likely going to lose. And so that last game of the season for Florida's at 5 wins right now. So Florida State's coming into Florida in the last game of the season in a situation where a win would make Florida bowl eligible. Not only that, it's a rivalry game. It's been a disappointing season for Florida. And just like Georgia Tech would love nothing more than to be the team that spoils it for their in-state rival, Georgia, I think Florida would love nothing more than to be the team that knocks off Florida State and gives them their first and only loss of the regular season. On top of that, Florida is actually a more talented team than Florida State, and I don't mean that as an insult at Florida State. Obviously, Florida State's got better starters, a better quarterback play, however you want to say. I agree with you. I'm just talking about the talent index, the roster top to bottom. And one of the ingredients that goes into a potential upset a lot of times is having a more talented roster that just isn't performing well. And that's the case for Florida. I don't expect Florida to win. They'll be an underdog. I get it. But it's a home game for Florida. And like I said, it's kind of an all-or-nothing type situation for Billy Napier and the Gators. So I don't think that's necessarily an easy game for Florida State, but obviously one that they should win. The North Alabama game this week is just a throwaway gimme game there for Florida State. That's one of those things where if you're a Florida State fan, you just don't want to see anybody get injured there in a kind of nothing game against North Alabama. Washington, not an easy schedule either to wrap things up. They're actually an underdog this week on the road at Oregon State. Oregon State is favored by 1 or 2 points, depending on when you look and where you look. Very dangerous game here for Washington. Now, I actually think that Washington's going to go in and win this game. I just trust Michael Penix more than I do Oregon State's quarterback, the Clemson transfer, DJ Uiagalelei, our buddy, the ukulele, DJ Ugabadoogie. But this is a very dangerous spot here. Oregon State is going to play a critical role here in the playoffs down the stretch. They play Washington this week, then they play Oregon next week. So they play 2 potential playoff teams to end the season. Oregon State does, and they're no slouch. I mean, they're ranked 11th. They're sitting on 2 losses. Now, I don't think they're in the same league as Washington or Oregon, but we've all been watching college football a long time. We've all seen a lot of upsets. I would keep an eye on Oregon State. Would anybody be shocked if Oregon State beat one or the other? Either Washington or Oregon? It definitely wouldn't be the strangest thing I've ever seen when it comes to college football. Oregon State, a key team to watch down the stretch here as they're taking on 2 potential playoff teams in the last 2 weeks of the regular season. Speaking of Oregon, their last couple of games on the road at Arizona State, and then, like I mentioned, at home against Oregon State. Arizona State is probably the worst or second worst team in the Pac-12. It's them or Colorado. And then Oregon State, we just talked about them. So a tricky spot here. Again, an in-state rivalry game to end the season. In this case, though, unlike Georgia and Florida State, Oregon will be taking on a ranked in-state rival. Even if Oregon State loses this week to Washington, they will still be ranked with just 3 losses for the Civil War game. Is that what they call this one? Oregon and Oregon State. It sure seems like either Oregon or Washington is going to lose a game in the regular season. Doesn't it feel like Oregon State's going to beat one of those 2? That's going to be real interesting to watch down the stretch there. Louisville is another team that could mess a lot of things up because if they beat Florida State in the ACC title game, it's going to be hard for the ACC to get in, I think, including getting Louisville in. But we're not talking about conference championship games in this one, so let's skip over that. Texas is another one. Everybody just assumed a while ago that, Texas and Oklahoma headed for a rematch in the Big 12 title game. Oklahoma kind of fell off a little bit. Texas hasn't looked great the last few weeks, but they managed to keep on winning. They did slip up against Oklahoma earlier in the year, that 34-30 loss in the Red River Shootout, but wins against Houston, BYU, Kansas State, and TCU since then. Their last 2 wins have been by 3 points. 33-30 over Kansas State, and that was at overtime, I believe, and 29-26 against TCU. And this week at Iowa State, next week home against Texas Tech. The Texas Tech game, they should win that one. It's at home. Texas Tech has been one of the more disappointing teams in the Big 12 this season, in my opinion, them and Baylor. But on the road at Iowa State, this is not a gimme here. Iowa State has been known to knock off some of the big boys in the Big 12. It's not that rare, really. This is a very dangerous game here for Texas on the road at Iowa State. They've lost Jonathan Brooks for the remainder of the season with an ACL. Their running back. They do have Quinn Ewers back at quarterback and a stable of really good wide receivers. We'll see how their defense holds up on the road at Iowa State, but this is a very dangerous and tricky game here for Texas coming up this week on the road at Iowa State, and then closing things out with Texas Tech. So who does that leave in the top 10? Let's see. We're up to number 7. Alabama, of course, would be up next. They've got the Iron Bowl at the end of the year. We all know that. And then Chattanooga this week. So, Chattanooga is a nothing game. Again, kind of like with Florida State playing North Alabama. If you're an Alabama fan or looking at the Alabama game this weekend, it's just let's get out of here with no injuries, right? That's it. It's a name your score game. They could beat Chattanooga by as many points as they want to. But then they've got the Iron Bowl coming up on the road at Auburn. Now, Bama's a much better team than Auburn. We've seen that over the course of the season. And they'll be a massive favorite on the road at Auburn. But just ask an Alabama fan, a lot of weird things have happened over the years at Jordan-Hare Stadium in Auburn in big games, whether you're talking about the Iron Bowl, the Georgia-Auburn game, whatever the case. There are a lot of weird things that have happened at Jordan-Hare. I don't think Alabama's going to go in there and lose. In fact, I think they'll win fairly easily on the road at Auburn. But it would not be the weirdest thing any of us have ever seen if that's a one-possession game in the fourth quarter between Alabama and Auburn. I'm not predicting that, but we've just seen it so many times. But Alabama appears to be headed for 2 more wins to close out their season. Next on the list would be Missouri, but they've already got the 2 losses. So we've got the final 1-loss team, Louisville. They close out the season at Miami and home against Kentucky. So, again, is this... Are they playing Ohio State and Michigan in back-to-back weeks? No, but this is not an easy way to close out the season for Louisville on the road at Miami, who, look, whatever you think about Miami, and I've had a lot of fun clowning them, right? They are an up-and-down team that's got some talent, and we've seen them play well at times this year. They beat Texas A&M early in the year. They hung in there with Florida State last week, losing 27-20. Now they've got some quarterback issues. They had benched Van Dyke and put Williams in. Now Williams gets hurt, so Van Dyke comes back in. So they got some issues that they would have to get worked out in order to win this game. But this is by no means a game where Louisville can just show up down there, roll their helmet out on the field, and win the game. I think this is going to be a close, competitive game. And then the following week, again, an in-state rivalry game against Kentucky. They close their season out with Kentucky every year. Kentucky's not had a great season this year. In fact, it's been a little disappointing. And they seem to have gotten worse as the season has gone along. But if for some reason Devin Leary decides to have another like Tennessee-type game, they lost to Tennessee, but Devin Leary looked great in that game. If Devin Leary plays well, again, it's an in-state rivalry game. You see weird things happen sometimes. So I don't think it's a guarantee Louisville gets through the rest of the regular season undefeated. So I guess what I'm getting at here, when you look at this list of 9 potential playoff teams, and you got so many people going on and on about, what's going to happen if these 4 teams win out, and then you got these 2 teams that win out, and who gets in, who gets out of this. That's not likely to happen. A lot of these teams, half of these teams, are probably going to lose in the next 2 weeks. Would you be surprised if half of those 9 teams that we just went through, again, Georgia, Ohio State, Michigan, Florida State, Washington, Oregon, Texas, Missouri, Louisville, sorry. 9 teams with 0 losses or 1 losses. Are you going to be shocked if half of those teams lose a game in the next 2 weeks? Again, Ohio State and Michigan play each other. That's a guaranteed loss. Florida State has to go on the road to Florida. Tricky game. Washington is an underdog this week to Oregon State, and then Oregon has to play that same Oregon State team next week. Texas plays on the road at a tricky Iowa State team this week. Alabama's got the Iron Bowl. And Louisville with a road game at Miami and then an in-state rivalry game against Kentucky. Georgia, 2 back-to-back road games, on the road at Tennessee, on the road at Georgia Tech, an in-state rivalry situation there. I wouldn't be shocked at all if 4 of these 9 teams lose in the next 2 weeks. That eliminates half the playoff teams right there. And then you've still got the conference championship games coming up the week after. I don't think it's going to be nearly as complicated to figure out the 4 playoff teams when we get to that point as a lot of people think it's going to be. These 9 teams are obviously really, really good. You don't get to 10-0 or 9-1 without being really good. I don't want to hear anything about any of these teams' schedules. There's lots of teams in the country that have quote-unquote easier cupcake schedules that aren't 10-0 or 9-1. All 9 of these teams are good. Only 4 of them are going to the playoffs. Let me know down below which ones you think it will be and who's the most likely on this list to lose one of these games in the regular season over the next couple of weeks. Appreciate you watching. Have a good morning.